left. Turn left.
God, those communists are amazing.
All right, everybody. Welcome back to the Turn Leftist podcast. So I'm Mike, and I'm here with Sterling and Jaron. Tonight we have a different episode than usual. We have an interview with a congressional candidate from Vermont, Chris Helali. He ran as an open communist in this past election. So we were lucky enough to get some time from him to interview him and ask him a lot of questions about what it was like to run for Congress as an open communist. His time that he spent fighting ISIS in Syria with the YPG, his time studying in China. And we had a really great time talking to him. And we hope to do it again sometime. But yeah, here is our interview with Chris Helali.
Hell yeah.
Hey. Hold
Hey,
on.
welcome.
Let's see, the volume is a little low. Let me see if I can adjust that here, if there's any way to raise this up. Let's see. All right.
Oh, yeah. Hey, Chris.
I'm going to admit, you look like a boomer, like my grandfather trying to figure it out with the buttons in front of it. Like touching the screen. It looks like my grandfather trying to FaceTime me.
Well, I know, because there's a phone and I have it on a stand here. So
Yeah.
Okay, there we go.
All
We're
right.
good now.
Excellent.
So how's everybody doing tonight? Everybody's doing well.
Yeah, how are you?
Yeah.
Doing great.
Beautiful. Doing well, living the dream.
Every day.
This is exciting. I mean, this is a good get. Like, we haven't done any interviews
Every
yet.
day.
We've only been doing this for a couple months, but to get like a Congress candidate first interview out of the gate, that's pretty awesome for us, man. So thank you for doing this.
Absolutely.
That's awesome. I'm so happy.
And I'm super excited to also show our fans and our listeners, because we do still get a couple thousand listeners a week, even though we are a fairly new podcast. But I am really excited to show them that it's not just theory, that there are actually people out here like yourself who are very active and out there and doing things to move these incredible causes forward. And I think it's going to be very inspiring for our listeners and also introduce some new people to you. I'm very excited to do that. I was actually introduced to you from one of our friends who actually listens to the podcast, Tris, and he's been telling us about the party that you're affiliated with for a while, and he started telling us about you, and I was like, man, this guy just sounds like a total fucking badass. And then he's like, I could probably get him on the podcast, and I'm like, that sounds hell yeah.
Well, I'm very, very honored. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Great to be with you all.
Great to have you, man. So, I think I was saying to you in the DMs that most of our listeners are probably very open to a leftist, communist message. So this will be hopefully better than, what you were having to do when you were running and campaigning and trying to appeal to the greater public. You don't have to hide your power level, I should say. You can say whatever you want to say and they'll be amenable. But I will also say that they're probably mostly baby leftists. Like, I think most of our listeners are probably in their early 20s, maybe even teenagers or Gen Z, whatever. But yeah, like Sterling was saying, I think this will really be a big boost for them to hear that people are actually doing some practice and doing this kind of thing. So that'll be good.
Trying.
Yeah. So I guess we can just get right into it, getting into some of these questions. I know you said it was cool to address your background. So I definitely wanted to ask you if there's anything you'd like to talk about from your time in the military. I know that frequently came up in your campaign messaging and debating people. You would frequently bring that up, but obviously it's a great talking point for someone who's running for office to have military service in their background. Is there anything you'd like to say about that and like how that influenced your views as a communist?
So I was a communist before that, and I, went off to college, and I had to find a way to pay for college. And so, it's aptly called the poverty draft, because people who need to pay for school and don't want to be in debt and whose families can't necessarily help out as much as, schools cost. I decided to join the military. I had really limited options. So joined the military, still as an open Marxist at the time. I grew up as a Marxist-Leninist, and I slowly switched and became a little bit more leaning towards Marxist theory in the sense of devoid of the Soviet Union and China and sort of the experience of actually existing socialist states. Much more academic, you can say. You're sort of a David Harvey type, Richard Wolff, this kind of stuff that moved the needle a little bit away from what would be considered dogmatic or orthodox Marxism as established in the Soviet Union. So by college time, by the time I joined the military, I was already in the direction of, okay, I'll do this. And yeah, of course, the US is imperialist and all that. I'll try to skirt my way out of any sort of deployments if I can. But as the world has it, after basically my 3.5 years in ROTC, it came the time to put all of our choices for what we wanted to do as a job. So the number one job I picked was an engineer because I said, fuck it, I'll be an engineer. I'll build bridges. I'll build, roads and dams.
Yeah.
And, all right, I'll serve in the imperialist army to help pay for school, but at least I can get some tools out of it that we can use afterwards.
Sure.
Uncle Sam had other ideas and was like, hey, you're Iranian, you've got good background, you've got language skills, you are an excellent student, excellent marksman, you graduated airborne school, you're a paratrooper, you got this award from Germany for military proficiency and gold medal. We're going to put you as an infantry officer. How do you like that? And I was like, wait, what? Wait, what did you just say? And my officer was like, this is a great honor. You're going to the 82nd Airborne, leading troops in Afghanistan. I'm like, I didn't know. No. Infantry was my last choice. Last choice out of 16. Last one, baby. I didn't know. Are you kidding me? Everybody was
About
like,
what year was this?
This was 2011.
Okay. Oh.
So, this is Obama.
Yeah.
This is the year really when Occupy started. I graduated in May. Occupy launched in this fall. So there I am. I'm commissioning in May of 2011 with the blue of the infantry. And I'm like, holy shit, how the hell do I get out of this? Because my commanding officer was like, I know you're a Marxist and this and that, but, you're just doing the duty to your country and you go there, lead the troops, the camaraderie and all this stuff. And I'm like, I don't think so. And actually, there was a sergeant there at the time who basically told me that he asked me if I knew about Pat Tillman. And I said, yeah, of course. And he said, I want you to know, if you're open with your politics, you'll come back in a body bag, but it won't be from enemy fire. So I thought to myself, oh, fuck, I'm out of here. Get me the hell out of here. Real fucking fast.
Yeah, that's actually was something I was wondering when you said that you went into the military as an open Marxist. Like, I was going to ask you, what was that like? Like, you had to have gotten some resistance,
Oh my God, yeah, of course. I mean, like, I was, we call it smoking, like hazing, when they are doing all the, intense physical training and all this kind of stuff. Oh, they would always yell at me and tell me, my books won't save me. We defeated the Soviet Union, all this kind of stuff, classic stuff. So I really kept it to myself. I was very much like book oriented in terms of even like military studies. So I studied like international rules and conventions for like land warfare and things like that. And I would always like fight with, even in training exercises about like certain things that we were tasked with doing. I'm like, I don't really think that's the appropriate way. And they're like, shut the fuck up and do your job. And I'm like, just saying,
Yeah.
So I was definitely I was the black sheep in that whole thing. I found a few fellow travelers in there, especially amongst the enlisted ranks. Few people who were much more on the left, you could say, but the vast majority that I met, especially in the infantry, were on the right. For sure. Like people are talking about like all these militia people and things like that. That shit's been going on for decades. There's nothing new.
Oh yeah.
That kind of phenomena, that pipeline of people who come into the military and then exit and end up becoming, mercenaries, Blackwater types or militia types or, I mean, it's think about it. It's free training. If you think about it, it's free training. And you can kill people if you really want to do that, and you really have no recourse. I mean, you saw war criminals get out all the time. Oh, he's a hero for our country. Boom, he's pardoned. Yeah, and that's what it was like. So after I commissioned, I had I think 6 or 8 months before I would have to start training, and then end up going to Fort Bragg, and then from there off to Afghanistan. And I said, oh fuck this. So what did I decide to do? Went to one of the officers afterwards, and I said, I had a dream. And in the dream, the Lord came to me and said that I should serve my country as a chaplain. He said, really? Forgotten country. All right, we're switching you from the infantry chaplain corps. So I got out. That was that easy. I thought to myself, holy shit.
Yeah.
That's a story.
Mazel
tov.
So I migrated from the infantry to the chaplain corps, went to divinity school. And while I was there, got to relax, put my feet up, read liberation theology, feminist theology, queer theology. And I thought to myself, this is great, but I still have the one big thing. I got to get out of the military. How am I going to do it? Well, lucky enough, which I didn't know beforehand, the chaplain corps, along with like the JAG corps and the medical professions, you can resign at any point without any penalty. So I resigned. I said, all right, I resign as a conscientious objector. I had no problem. Same day, I was honorably discharged, and hands clean, and that's it. I got out.
That's a fascinating
That's cool.
loophole that I don't think most people know.
Yeah.
Most people do not know that, but I'm sure now they're tightening that whole belt,
Yeah.
you know.
Sure.
But it was great. It was phenomenal to be able to get out and to not have to worry about, you know, I thought I was going to have to go jail or flee or, you know, I don't know, end up, somewhere else. But I will tell you, the one good thing I had was all that training and all of that knowledge, you know, gets passed on to comrades as well. And, you know,
Yeah.
Uncle Sam knows that. They spent all that time training me, and they're like,
Yeah.
oh, wait, he's a red. Yep. You know?
I just have to wonder how many people end up enlisting just because they want to get an education. There is no patriotic conviction.
Quite a few. A lot of people were there because it was a good way to pay for school, the GI Bill. A lot of people were there for health benefits. Oh, yeah, it's not only patriotism. Oh, no. No. For a lot of people, it's not patriotism. It's just a means to get out of poverty, to get a little bit of upward mobility. I mean, if you think about it, the military is a socialist kind of endeavor in a way. It's like, all right, you come, you give, and we'll give you back, you know, education, healthcare, all these benefits, you know, for your work. And it's just like, I mean, if you had that kind of on a mass scale, you'd be looking at a totally different situation. So yeah, of course, people go in there. Yeah. So, and one of the things that you mentioned, I mean, now, of course, people see me and they're like, you know, they know my politics and they're like, you never served this nation. And then I just take out a picture. I'm like, oh, here's me in my uniform. Medal, you know? And the guy's like, oh, shit. Yeah, of course, you know. Yeah, I didn't go fight in your imperialist wars, but I certainly put on the uniform.
Yeah.
How do you think serving would have affected you long term? I mean, if you would have really been in the system, say, another 10 years, I mean, do you think even someone with your background and conviction could really start just becoming, you know, indoctrinated in the system? I feel like a lot of people that don't go in for patriotic reasons just end up getting converted to it.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, I had a strong will. They probably would have stopped promoting me. It would have been like, you know, after a certain point, you just stop getting promotions and then they kind of say, hey, there's the door, you know, you got to go.
Yeah.
But a lot of people who go in, like, you know, without ideological convictions, without a real strong understanding of their own positions, they get sucked in real quick. Real quick.
So I did want to ask you up front, you know, obviously Biden just got inaugurated yesterday. I wanted to open up the whole thing with the joke saying, oh, all the problems are going to be fixed now. Everything's going to be so much better now, right? And I imagine you'd have you'd have a similarly sarcastic take on that. I have a feeling, I mean, I kind of have the sneaking suspicion that Biden is going to start another war with all the contributions he's gotten from the defense industry that are just right out in the open.
Interesting.
What is your kind of take on what do you expect out of the next 4 years of a Biden administration?
I expect same old. You know, Wall Street as a priority, major monopolies and industries getting their big checks and their deregulation. You know, that sort of stuff is still going to continue. Definitely on the war front, we're looking at, I mean, just think about all the people that Biden has surrounded himself with, like Victoria Nuland and these types. I mean, we're looking at problems. We're looking at big problems ahead. For example, Biden just said that he's going to recognize Guaido as the leader of Venezuela. Again, opening up a whole nother can of worms. Biden is very pro-NATO. He's an Atlanticist, so he's definitely, you know, much more confrontational. And after 4 years of Russiagate, we're going to see an escalation in tensions with Moscow. And that also pivots to the Ukraine situation. And of course, Biden is intimately tied with Ukraine, was as vice president, has deep connections there. And that proxy war is extremely dangerous, you know, and we saw that during the impeachment trial for Trump, the first one, and everything that transpired there. We're going to see an expansion of NATO and NATO's role. And I read today, I don't know if it's true yet, we'll find out in the coming days and weeks, but it looks like Biden is going to increase troop numbers in Iraq against what Trump did, which was trying to take out troops from Iraq. So I don't know what this means long term. All I can say is that there were a lot of people warning us about what a Biden presidency would look like and what it would be. And I think we just have a much more reactionary administration on the Democratic side, even more so than Obama was, and he was right-wing enough. We're going even further because the whole dialogue and conversation is moving to the right. It's a race to the right to catch, I don't know, the mythical Republican voter who's going to vote for a Democrat.
Yeah.
But
they totally exist, I promise.
A good German.
They're there. It's the unicorn. I don't much see, of course, there are going to be some policy things that are good and decent, like, for example, the executive order sort of taking funding away from the wall, or the Muslim ban, which, of course, affected me and my family because I'm Iranian. So Iran was one of the countries on that ban.
Yeah.
But in the broad scheme, looking at it, holistically, I think we're in for a sharpening of the contradictions and for an escalation in tensions, which is very dangerous, especially given the state of the planet and the state of things in this country.
Right. Did you have something, Jaron?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask. So I was on your website, and I love it, by the way. I love that you just lay everything out in a really easy to digest manner. And just since you brought up NATO, I really also appreciate that you're adamantly against NATO. And I was hoping maybe you could expand upon that.
Sure, of course. NATO as an organization was, of course, founded as a collective defense organization for what we consider to be the Atlantic sort of alliance, that is the United States, Canada, and then your Western Europe, against what it perceived to be Soviet and satellite state aggression. NATO was formed, and then the Warsaw Pact was formed as a reaction to that. It's interesting to note that a lot of comrades don't have a deep enough history of history itself. They are very good on theory. You'll get a lot of read Marx, read Lenin, read Mao, but very rarely do you get comrades who, for example, read books about the CIA and Allen Dulles, and read about, for example, Operation Gladio, when denazification actually led to the United States employing thousands of former Nazi officials and SS soldiers as basically troops to prevent communist incursion, and then using them to foment anti-communist purges in their own countries. For example, many of you might know, and some of your listeners might not know, but they should look up the Years of Lead in Italy. So what many people don't know is that right after World War II, the Italian communists, which spearheaded the partisan movement, the anti-fascist movement, were slated to win. Italy would have gone communist. The United States immediately intervened. And through manipulation of votes and through terrorism outright, the communists lost. And then through that, they began sabotage, they began terrorism, they fomented an artificial crisis that prompted a bunch of left organizations to arm themselves and then fight against the right wing, not knowing that that right wing was being armed by the CIA to change the paradigm in Italy, make the left less palatable for the Italian population, and lead Italy right into the arms of the European Union and later a strong NATO ally. The US has a massive military base in Italy, has tactical nuclear weapons based there as well on fighters. And so, of course, when you look at this history, you end up realizing the US in its NATO countries actually really crushed a lot of communist movements in Europe, because after World War II, the communists were the victors. By the populations, they were seen as the victorious ones. Stalin was a hero for many of the partisans all over, for my family in Greece, for Italians, for French, for all over. They had his poster that was part of that time period, was the Red Army, the hammer and sickle over the Reichstag, That's what it was about.
Yeah.
It's interesting to note that comrades might have a deep analysis about political or economic theory, but tend to forget the tentacles of, I hate the fact that the right wing took the term deep state, because it was actually a left term originally. And it has connections with Turkey, understanding different politics of basically parallel intelligence agencies and military industrial, complexes that have tremendous power and concentrated power, that are able basically to enact state power without even using the democratic quote unquote means. If you're the CIA, you don't have to worry about shit. Yeah. Even if they cut off your funding, you have like 900 front organizations. You can make billions still, So
or you can deal
speaking
drugs.
about, of course, it's heroin, cocaine, all of it. And speaking about NATO, NATO is basically a big cartel. That's what a lot of the European communists consider it. It's a big cartel. It's a big criminal organization. It's a terrorist organization historically. And the problem is that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, basically at the end of the Soviet Union, when things were falling apart, Gorbachev went and spoke with Reagan and Thatcher and basically said, NATO has to, end. We will do our part with the Warsaw Pact. You have to do your part, and you have to promise not to encroach on the former Soviet satellite states. You can't come to Eastern Europe and threaten the sovereignty and sort of the security of what later became the Russian Federation. And Yeltsin also got those promises from George H.W. Bush and later from Clinton. Well, guess what happened? NATO expanded. So if you're looking into the mindset of the Russian Federation, I mean, every year NATO expands. And when NATO expands, it uses the most anti-communist, the most right-wing, the most fascist elements of the countries in which it's expanding to help propel it forward, to help bring about a national sentiment that's anti-Russian, anti-Soviet, anti-communist against the history, right? So it's totally historically revisionist. So a lot of comrades don't realize that, all of the Eastern European countries today have been subjected basically to a massive, psychological operation to basically extinguish the history of the Soviet Union and of the triumph, the anti-fascist triumph, and then to rehabilitate war criminals and fascists like Stepan Bandera in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So that Ukraine today is called by some of us comrades Banderistan, right? Because Bandera has become a hero for Ukrainian nationalists. Before he was such a hated a figure by the communists in Ukraine. And now all of a sudden he's become a Ukrainian patriot. This is a guy who massacred and committed genocide against Jews, Poles, Romani, and all different types, and communists, of course. And now he's a hero, and America is giving money and weapons, and Israel is giving money and weapons. And other NATO countries are giving money and weapons to these fascist organizations. Because, of course, you can be fascist and be a Zionist. You can be an anti-Semite and be a Zionist. Of course.
Yeah.
Just have your own state. Go over there. We don't want you here. Go over there and fight Muslims. Kill them all. We support you. So that's when I talk about NATO, I talk about a criminal organization that is a threat to world security. It's a threat to the security and sovereignty of nations, not only in Europe, but also all over the world, because NATO invades Africa. Libya, right? NATO invades the Middle East. A lot of the operations in Afghanistan, Syria, all these wars, NATO was involved. NATO has expanded to the Americas, and now Colombia is a NATO partner, right? Of course, Colombia
just
is
in time for Venezuela.
Of course. Yeah, absolutely. So all of these things have to be taken holistically to understand this terrorist network. And that's ultimately what it is. So when I speak out against NATO, some people think I'm right-wing, or because Trump was also talking bad about NATO. But Trump was very smart. He was talking bad about NATO to get them to pay even more money into NATO. I love it.
The old reverse psychology.
I love it. I'm telling you, this guy, Machiavelli. But
I can't remember the guy's name, but one of the original, I don't remember even his position, but I remember seeing in a similar vein to Operation Paperclip, where you had the U.S. importing all these Nazis right into their space program. One of the first people in NATO was an open Nazi beforehand. What was
I got you. It's Adolf Hausinger.
Yeah, exactly. Hausinger, yep. That's right.
Yeah, Hausinger served on the NATO committee in the 60s. But yeah, he was literally an SS officer, like a high-ranking one. And the U.S. was like, yeah, you're guilty as hell. But hey, you want to be in NATO?
Hell yeah.
Basically, it was like, hey, are you a Nazi? Okay, you fucked up. But guess what? You hate communists, right? All right,
exactly. As long as you're not
my enemy.
Yeah, exactly.
So then also wanted to ask you, just getting a little more into your background, do you want to talk at all about your time that you spent studying in China? I feel like we'll also get into this quite a bit. I have a whole section here of things that I wanted to ask you, trying to just debunk, myths about what people, even on the left here in America, tend to think about what is going on in China. That's definitely a major stumbling block, I think, that we all encounter. Like every time we say that China is doing something good and resisting imperialism, anything they can do to resist American hegemony across the globe, we catch so much flack, and people come across with the same talking points like, oh, but they have billionaires, oh, but the Uyghurs, all the things that they want to say from a Western perspective where they've never been there. They don't really know anything about it firsthand. But as someone who's been there, what do you think people are getting the wrong impression about? And what was it like just being there?
I loved it. I mean, I studied there for 2 years. I lived there for 2 years, got my master's in Marxist philosophy.
Oh, badass.
From one of the top 10 Chinese universities. And I thought it was amazing. Of course, any country, I've been to all of the actually existing socialist countries. And any country you go to, you're going to find things you disagree with. Of course, naturally. I mean, not everything is perfect. Even good comrades would tell you about that. That's why we have self-criticism. But the ability of China to raise hundreds of millions out of poverty, to create a society that went from literally peasant farmers, even worse than serfdom.
I remember this
You know,
story
to do
somewhere
that,
else.
to go from there all the way, like the Soviet Union, to
Mhm.
space, to, you know, literally the country of China is far more advanced than the US. If you
Yeah.
think about, for example, transportation,
Mhm.
public transportation, China has high-speed railway connecting the entire country. I
mean,
can't
I would
even
kill
get
for
a
that.
train, an Amtrak, to go to California. Are you shitting me?
Yeah. No, I'm jealous. I would love
I've
that.
got 3 vehicles outside of my house. Like, why? The only 2 people live in my house.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, one of the best things was the ability to just hop on a bus, a train, all this stuff, and to go anywhere I wanted with just such ease. Public,
Oh,
affordable,
man.
accessible. I mean, for me, it was amazing. My parents came to visit me in 2015 when I was graduating, and they were stunned. They couldn't believe it, that there was just high speed. We took this high speed train from Beijing to Wuhan, where I was studying. I know Wuhan before COVID, nobody knew where it was. Now everybody's
Yeah.
like, "Oh my God, you studied in Wuhan." You know, are you CIA? I'm like, dude, are you kidding me?
And then wink at them.
And they're back to normal now. Wuhan is fine now.
Of course, back to normal. I mean, that's just the way it is. I mean, also, you know, China is unique. A lot of people are not religious. You don't have to worry about a lot of the, you know, the unscientific. A lot of people are interested in progress, technology, science, you know, industry, innovation. A lot of people, like you could say, are not so. I mean, of course, there's Chinese traditional medicine, all that stuff, but a lot of that stuff was extinguished in the communist, you know, experiment. So as socialism was being built, you know, a lot of the old Chinese traditions were sort of brushed away. Now, of course, the Chinese government today is trying to balance. Okay, we can read a little Confucius, we can do a little, you know, Qigong and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But at the same time, nope, we need to focus on the important parts of development of our society.
Yeah.
Another big thing, of course, I had the opportunity to visit various areas of minorities in China. So I was able to go for 2 weeks to Xinjiang and, you know, meet with Uyghurs, see Xinjiang and the Uyghur population. I was able to go to areas that were autonomously Tibetan and see the monasteries and visit with local Tibetan population. And I definitely don't see what everybody else sees. I mean, I was there on the ground. Were there issues? Of course. I mean, there are issues everywhere. You know, for example, there was a big, heavy police presence in Urumqi, in Ulumichi, where I was. That's the main city in Xinjiang. But that was because there was a terrorist attack in 2014 in Kunming. And I think over a dozen people were stabbed to death in the railway station by terrorists from this East Turkestan separatist movement, an Islamist movement. There was also a ramming of a vehicle in Beijing at Tiananmen Square, where it caught fire and tried to run over people. I mean, this kind of stuff was there, and there was just a police presence and everything like that. But people, I mean, Xinjiang has more mosques than all of the US, and the Chinese government helps to build mosques. I don't really understand how the US can all of a sudden criticize Chinese government for somehow not loving Muslims when the traditional Uyghur language is on every Chinese banknote. Signs are bilingual, you know? In this country, can you imagine signs that were bilingual with Arabic? People would be going fucking nuts.
Yeah,
it would be insane.
What I've typically encountered when I talk to anybody who says anything about the Uyghur genocide and they try to compare it to the Holocaust and they call Xi Jinping Hitler or whatever, the shortest way I think to explain it from what I read is that they're dealing with a population that has been radicalized into like a fundamentalist sect of Islam, and try to imagine what the US would do with that same situation. And what the U.S. already does with people who are just refugees from South American countries that the U.S. is responsible for putting into the condition that people need to flee from those countries and be refugees. They put them in border camps, they put them in literal concentration camps, and actually are forcibly sterilizing women in these camps. Like exactly what the U.S. is accusing China of doing to these Uyghurs. And in reality, what they are doing is giving them vocational training, they're setting them up with employment afterwards. They're giving them education to see, hopefully, educate them out of the fundamentalist views that they have. And what they call forcible sterilization of women is them giving them family planning services that they didn't have access to because they were in a far right sect. But again, I'm still understanding this from my position here in the West, having never seen it on the ground. Like, would you say that that view is correct, or would you say that I'm still getting it wrong? Like, if I am wrong, I would love to hear from someone who has been there.
Did you want to jump in? I saw a hand raised.
Oh yeah, Darren, did you have anything else to add to that?
Well, now I'm going to give this poor guy a compound question, because what I've heard is that there are Sunni insurgencies, but also compounding with that is the presence of U.S. intel agencies in places like Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and places like that, where they are taking advantage of these Sunni mindsets, which is exactly what we do in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And that, yes, there are terrorist groups who are Uyghur, but at the same time, that is not the majority of the population, and any threat to China is being manufactured by the West.
That's absolutely correct. And that connects both questions, actually. So the question is interrelated. For example, China's campaign to root out terrorism, quote unquote, and sort of this, de-radicalization is actually a very small segment of the population, as you were saying. Most Uyghurs are just everyday citizens, go about their life, go to mosque, pray. Some of them don't even pray. Some of them are just Uyghur ethnically, but are not Muslim, right? That's totally possible. It exists there. There are Uyghurs who are Orthodox Christian. There are Uyghurs who are other religions. Okay, no problem. So these camps, of which I never saw a camp, if they exist as they're purported, I mean, these are vocational camps, and there cannot possibly be millions of people in these camps. It's just not, I cannot fathom how you could have millions of people in camps and every Muslim country in the world say, oh, none of this exists. UN is not raising a stink about it. Only it's US, it's the Five Eyes, US, Canada, Australia, everybody's like, oh, Uyghurs in camps. Wait a minute, motherfucker. What about Guantanamo? You forgot. What about your black sites? And that's not to go about to whataboutism. What it is to say is that's not happening in China altogether. It's projection. It's projection. And as you were saying, first and foremost, by understanding the history of CIA and American intel and what they've done. For example, if you ask somebody about Hamas, right? Most people don't know Israel helped to create Hamas. Why? Why did they do that? Because who was very popular at the time for Palestinians? Yasser Arafat, George Habash, nationalists and communists, right? So how do you defeat nationalists and communists? Throw in a little bit of radical Islam in there. Spice up the dish, so to speak. Let them fight amongst each other for territory, right? So, of course, the US has supported Wahhabi and Salafist jihadist groups for decades. Of course. They've been the patsies of the US empire, going and doing their bidding. In Afghanistan as the Mujahideen, always, always, always go after the Bill Maher's of the world like this. The Bill Maher's, the Sam Harris's, the IDW folks. Go after them and say, listen, motherfucker, Afghanistan was a liberated society. Women in miniskirts studying physics. People advancing as a society. And then your motherfucker empire supported the most reactionary people to defeat the quote-unquote evil communists who were talking about, women should be equal to men. Women should be physicists and nuclear scientists. Women should be liberated. Society should be for all people. And you supported the people who put the burqa on, and then you come back and gaslight us and say we should go to war with them. You started it. Yeah. What do you mean we should go? What the fuck is this about,
Yep.
Go ahead.
Real quick, I just want to say, I think Jaron has found a place to interject that same kind of theme into just about every episode we've had so far. Just being able to tie in some instance of the U.S. arming some far-right reactionary group in some place where they just needed to create instability to thwart a communist regime when it was democratically elected, or to take some resources out of the area. But go ahead, Sterling.
Just one thing Chris was saying that I just wanted to highlight, because when Americans think of the Uyghur, encampments in China, what they picture and how the media portrays it is, if you're a Uyghur, you're in danger. They don't portray it as if you're one of these people who are, quote unquote, a terrorist that happen to also be a Uyghur, that there may be punishment for that. And I think that's one very important distinction, that when you hear Uyghurs are being thrown in re-education camps, you need to understand exactly which Uyghurs are we talking about. Are we talking about if you're a Uyghur, that's the risk you have? Or if you are committing terrorist action, or if you are involved with some of these quote unquote terrorist organizations within it, is the government in China going to fucking want to step in and do something about it? And like you said, it's a fraction of even the Uyghur population.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And, just to play off of what Chris and what Mike said, first off, I am I was raised conservative Jewish, and I 100% agree with what Chris said. is the state of Israel, first off, does not represent the will of the Jewish people at all. It is a European construct. It is an economic construct. It is not even a religious construct. That is used as a veil to prevent criticism of it. And the creation of these radical Muslim factions in the Middle East is almost always made by the West. And as far as what Mike said, I'm not even a huge fan of
off left
in general. So I don't have a dog in this fight, but I'm definitely going to point out that literally every time a government is overthrown, it's leaning that way. Like, I have no reason to lie to anyone about this because I'm not even on that fucking team. But it's a consistent model,
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And one of the big things that I like to explain to people is that it's pretty rich. You got to admit, it's comedic gold that the US all of a sudden has become so interested with the Muslims in Xinjiang, for example, when I didn't hear shit about an actual genocide going on with the Rohingya, right?
Yep.
In Burma.
Yeah.
But, Aung San Suu Kyi got Nobel Peace Prize, and, she's a US ally. So everybody quiet down. And it also affects India, and Modi's a US ally. So quiet down. So I just want to say that it's really quite rich that the US all of a sudden has become so interested in the plight of the Uyghurs, who just so happen to sit on an extremely vast area in China that's very rich in minerals, natural resources, geostrategic importance. You gotta love it.
I've heard this story before too.
It's so ironic and coincidental, and it's funny to me, we're recording this, I think it's now a day after Mike Pompeo just said that the U.S. recognizes China's actions against Uyghurs as a genocide. And just the irony of,
Christ.
People now taking him seriously when he was such a joke for the last 4 years because he's such a Trump sycophant. But then also anyone in the U.S. being suddenly so concerned for the well-being of Muslims in any way whatsoever, when we've just spent the last 20 years doing everything possible to just genocide them literally and just, attack all these people who had nothing to do with an attack on us. Now we're still taking this revenge in this weird way. It's so transparent. It's so obviously, just a ploy. But
Fox News all of a sudden cares about Muslims. Who would have guessed it?
Yeah.
I think if I'm remembering correctly, of course, I mean, half my family is Muslim, my dad, all my family in Iran. So if we remember, for example, the Iran-Iraq war, which the US played both sides. I think it was, I don't know if it was Kissinger or who it was at the time, said it's a pity that both sides can't lose. You gotta love it. That's the US.
Jesus Christ.
That's the US in a nutshell. Yeah. It's a pity that both, I know, because that's what they want. They said, oh yeah, pin them against each other, let them kill each other. That's what's happening right now in Syria, in Yemen, and all these places. That's what's happening.
That's exactly how they do that. Like, we actually just our last episode, we were talking about the Mujahideen, which I butchered that name, I gotta say probably 20 times in a row. And how after we backed them, we just completely abandoned them as the Taliban came in and just completely took over. And it's like we literally only cared because the war was with the Soviets. And once that war was over, we could give a fuck less.
Yeah,
absolutely. Of course.
To tie that in too, this was a question that I had. We're doing pretty much the same thing to the YPG and the Kurds right now. And if I understand correctly, did you spend some time with them?
I fought for 9 months with the YPG.
Really? I would love to hear about that just in general, because again, I've been in the U.S. my whole life, and I've read some stuff by Öcalan. If I'm pronouncing that right, I'm probably not.
Yeah, Abdullah Öcalan. Yeah.
Yeah. And, just the involvement of women in the movement and the entire process of just how the region handles itself is something that I really admire. And I've never met anyone that's been directly involved.
Yeah, definitely directly involved. So my ancestry is Iranian, Kurd, and Lur. So I have that background. So yeah, in 2016, I decided to go to northeast Syria, to an area called Rojava, before now the sort of a northeast autonomous area. And yeah, I decided to go. I was trained by Kurdish leadership of the PKK in Europe. And then I went in January 2017. I went to the YPG International Academy, met some phenomenal people there like Brace Belden, who you might know from the Truanon podcast. So Brace and I were there together. Cool. And I joined the International Freedom Battalion, which was an international group of communists, socialists, and anarchists. And I fought on the front lines for 2.5 months on the Raqqa campaign, phase 4, phase 5. And I was injured in an accident. I fell off a roof. And after I recovered, I left after 9 months of being there. And again, it's a complicated situation. I'm very supportive of the PKK before its ideological transformation. I think it's important as a background. I just did a huge podcast, by the way, if your listeners are interested. There's an amazing podcast called The East is a Podcast.
Okay.
And I did a 2-part series just on my experience in Syria.
Oh, wow.
So I would definitely encourage your listeners to go check it out.
Hell yeah. I'm going to go check it out.
Yeah, it's great.
Sounds great.
I won't get into all the details because it's long. I mean, we talked for, I think almost 2.5, 3 hours. I don't remember. It was forever. But it was great because there's so much detail. There's so many things we can talk about. I'll give a brief overview. Kurdistan as a national sort of identity marker exists for centuries. And of course, it's constantly shifting and transforming what it means. In the early 20th century, Kurds are promised a cut of land in the Middle East. They end up not getting it. It's important to note that the Kurds were the foot soldiers of the Ottoman Empire in their genocide of the Armenians and the Greek populations, of which the PKK is, I think, the only major Kurdish organization to officially apologize for the genocide against the Armenians and worked with the Armenian Secret Army for the Liberation of Armenia, which was a armed left-wing organization that fought the Turkish state and NATO for Armenian self-determination within Turkey itself. If anyone's interested, because we just had another war there in Artsakh, in Nagorno-Karabakh, between Armenia and Azerbaijan, if anyone's interested, looking at the history of Asala and Manti Melkonian, who was an Armenian who went to school at the University of California and then ended up traveling and became a guerrilla leader in Asala and then a general in the Armenian army during that war, and was martyred in the first war in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Artsakh, in the early 90s. My commander in Syria was a member of Asala. He was a Maoist guerrilla fighter for many years. He fought against Israel in the 80s with the Palestinians, with the PFLP. Went on to fight because he was Armenian himself from Turkey. He ended up fighting with Asala. He ended up joining the Turkish Communist Party Marxist-Leninist, which is a Maoist organization, and he trained me. I was one of the last 3 people that he trained fully before he was killed in Syria. So big, deep history. It was fascinating. I was in Syria with people who were with Bader Meinhof, who had trained with IRA, who had trained with Sandinistas who came, because at the time, many of the older comrades who were there, the older Yoldaşlar, were in Lebanon. Lebanon was the hotspot for all leftist radicals to go and to train for the Palestinian liberation struggle, right? Mm-hmm. So going back to the Kurdish question, so the Kurds lose out. The Kurds who were in the Soviet Union get an autonomous area that the Soviets called Red Kurdistan. And basically, Lenin wanted a independent state for the Kurds. And the Kurdish question was at every single party congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union from the beginning to the end. So the Kurdish question was an important national one. The Soviet Union supported the PKK. The PKK was formed in the late 70s and then started armed struggle in the early 80s. And this is where it gets a little bit hazy at the time when I went there, I was much more of an anarchist. So my transition in political life was ML to kind of Marxist, watered down, to an anarchist, anarcho-communist of types, back to an ML. And this experience really transitioned me out of anarchism back to ML, seeing it on the ground. But basically, what ended up happening was the Soviet Union supported the Kurds and gave them weapons, the PKK, and their number one ally in the region were the Palestinians. And after the Palestinian struggle in Lebanon, which the Kurds fought against Israel and had martyrs for that, the Kurds were based in a place called Damascus. Now it gets interesting. So Öcalan ends up basing the headquarters of the PKK in Damascus, right? Mm-hmm. And in Damascus, he is the guest of someone called Hafiz al-Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad. The Assads had a really close connection. And the reason was that Turkey was an enemy of Syria, right?
Yeah.
And Turkey is in NATO, right? Syria was allied with the Soviet Union. Turkey was an ally of NATO and the United States and held tactical US weapons. What better than to support a guerrilla movement of Kurds in Turkey to help destabilize Turkey, right? And the Syrian government supported other Marxist-Leninist groups that were from Turkey as well. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the PKK found itself without a state sponsor, really, in terms of a big state sponsor. The Soviet Union gave them weapons, money, intelligence, everything. All of a sudden, that went away. So the PKK had to do a little soul searching to figure out what's next, right? So it was in this time period where the PKK begins a transformation ideologically, which doesn't get solidified until the early 2000s. In 1999 or 98, 99, that period, basically Turkey puts its army on the border of Syria and says, if you don't get rid of Öcalan, we're going to invade and have war with Syria. So Hafiz al-Assad says, oh shit, it's not worth that much.
Yeah.
So he asks Öcalan to leave Damascus. So Öcalan and the PKK leave Damascus, and Öcalan begins traveling to different countries. He was also secretly supported by Greece, who's a member of NATO, but Greece really hates Turkey. So why not throw a little cash and weapons to the PKK on the side, right?
Oh my God, what a shit show.
It's a shit show. Big shit show. So he goes to Greece. He tries to go to Italy. He tries to go to Russia. Yeltsin won't have him because, of course, at that time, that things were getting pretty bad. And so, of course, he goes Italy, Greece, Russia won't have him. He goes to Kenya and he takes refuge in the Greek embassy there. And of course, in a joint operation, CIA, Mossad, and MIT, which is the CIA equivalent for the Turks.
Okay.
In a triple operation, they capture Öcalan and they send him back to Turkey, where he was tried and imprisoned. Originally given a death sentence, he was then given prison for life, and he's on basically his own island, guarded by thousands of Turkish troops. So that was the end of Öcalan. Öcalan's ideology and the PKK's ideology began to transform itself and move towards what's now called democratic confederalism, which is this sort of synthesis of Murray Bookchin's ideology. It's much more anarchist. Okay. It's much more autonomous leaning, very postmodern and post-structural. So away from dogmatic and orthodox Marxism. Yeah. Am I breaking up?
No, I was just saying I've never heard of that. That's fascinating.
Oh, yeah. And this is an interesting thing to research. This is where my disagreements come in. On the ground in Syria and in the mountains, the PKK still operates as a democratic centralist organization. Okay. Right? Really hard to get rid of that kind of organizational structure when it's so convenient and easy in a guerrilla formation. Yep. Pretty hard to have, sort of anarchist practices when you're in the middle of a war with, multiple NATO countries, including the second largest NATO army, right? On the ground in Syria, civil society was also structured that way. And a lot of the nice articles written by The Guardian and, the New York Times and The Atlantic and Vice and all this stuff about, the women of Rojava and things, true. Women had a completely new place in the society. They always had a really distinct place because Kurdish society is much more matriarchal than other neighboring societies. But a lot of it was romanticized. A lot of it wasn't necessarily the case. And the biggest problem was that the PKK ended up allying itself with US and NATO in Syria, right? So the PKK is a terrorist organization for the United States and for Turkey. But the PKK's branch in Syria, the YPG, the YPJ, and the PYD, got a different name so that they could skirt around the issue of the fact that they were actually supporting a terrorist organization. And actually, they admitted that. The Pentagon, one of the generals admitted that live on an interview. He said, yeah, we know, okay, PKK, but Syrian Democratic Forces. So the US and NATO imperialists used the Kurds as a proxy, but without ever taking them off the terrorist list because Turkey is much more valuable than the Kurds. Fuck the Kurds. I mean, the US has supplied, chemical weapons to gas the Kurds, when they were supporting Saddam Hussein in Halabja. So they don't really give a shit about Kurds, right? The Kurds in
Yeah.
2017 had a referendum in Iraq to have an independent country, and the US said no. So we should cut the myth of US support for the Kurds. The biggest thing is ultimately that without a Marxist-Leninist organization that advocates for a state, and this kind of nebulous idea of some kind of autonomous confederation of Kurdish areas, it doesn't take into reality and grasp the severity of the contradictions in the region and of all the power players there, right? I mean, it's really impossible you can't even do an autonomous organization or an autonomous area in the United States. You think you're going to do it in the Middle East when everybody's there vying for a peace? And it's one of the biggest areas of contradiction. So really what ended up happening is the Kurds tried to play the United States against Russia. They gave Russia a piece called Afrin, and they gave the United States, Kobani and Jazeera cantons. And in the end, the Russians said, we won't be played like that. So Afrin fell to the Turks. And now the Kurds have, I think, the situation that we talked about in 2017, which is ultimately to allow the Syrian Arab army to come back, to allow Syria's sovereignty over the areas again, and to basically have the Syrian army push out the Turks again. It won't happen if the Kurds are there as an autonomous group. And I mean, the US values Turkey over the Kurds any day. Yeah. So one of the biggest things that I saw on the ground was a lot of opportunism, a lot of ideological confusion over what was going on. I mean, some people openly said that Trump was a comrade for them because he was arming. It was 2017, he was president, so he was arming us at the time. If you think about it, the person giving the weapons to us was Trump and NATO. So it caused huge debates because ultimately here we are, a bunch of communists and anarchists and socialists and anti-imperialists who say death to America on any other day, but found ourselves on the same side as the US, the CIA, NATO, the British Special Forces, the French Special Forces, Israel, and ended up saying, wait a minute, what the fuck is this? And I talk about it in that episode I did with Sina Rahmani. I basically say, I became the proxy and the patsy. I was there to give a good cover story, some kind of good Vice documentary for the US to do its machinations and then to throw the Kurds under the bus because fuck them anyway. We're still bombing them on the side. Once you cross the border of Syria back into Iraq, you were a terrorist again. The US was supplying information to Turkey to bomb the Kurdish bases in the mountains, but then supporting them in Syria because they served a good purpose of providing not only a fight against ISIS, but also carving out the Syrian state so Assad couldn't get more territory and reclaim the oil fields in Deir ez-Zor. So I realized that it was there that I realized, okay, let me think about my political trajectory. Grew up in a communist family, right? Grandparents, great-grandparents, all communists. Grandparents fought against the Nazis. One of, my great uncle was killed by US-backed monarcho-fascists in 1947 in the Greek Civil War. Grew up in this family, Marxist-Leninist, went to college, became a kind of watered-down Marxist, went to graduate school, read a lot of postmodernism and post-structuralism, became an anarchist, and somehow that ideological position brought me to be allied with the CIA and the United States government. That was a problem. So I ended up saying, So I ended up saying, holy shit, it's a pipeline. It's so easy. You basically turn actually existing socialist history into the evil totalitarian boogeyman.
Yeah.
You end up talking about this vague, bullshit theories that really have no material reality. And then in the end, behind those material realities is the US. Boom. Easy enough. So it was then that I realized, oh shit. So we had big debates. We had big fights. I said, listen, are we going to be principled anti-imperialists or not? Because right now we're not being it. I mean, I saw horrible war crimes in Raqqa. Raqqa was the capital of the so-called caliphate, which the US was also supporting and Turkey was also supporting. Syria was a big clusterfuck. Everybody was there. Everybody was involved, right? So I ended up realizing that, this was like a mini World War III. Beyond Raqqa was General Soleimani that the US ended up, drone assassinating, right? Soleimani of Iranian Quds Force, Bashar al-Assad's Syrian Arab Army, the Russians, Nasrallah's Hezbollah, a bunch of Shia militias, groups like the Syria Social Nationalist Party, SSMP, two Syrian communist parties on that side. On the other side of the river, was the 9 communist parties of Turkey, the PKK, anarchist groups, the CIA, the United States, French Special Forces, British Special Forces, NATO coalition air cover, the Turks on the side, and in the middle, a wide swath of Wahhabi and Salafi groups supported by Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Israel, and then on the other side in the north, China owning some of the oil fields that were now occupied by the US.
Jesus.
World War III, baby. World War III.
Oh my
Everybody
God.
was there. Everybody was involved, right? One of the big things to think about is ultimately that I think a lot of people on the left got played the fool on this one. It's not to say that the Kurds shouldn't have rights or we shouldn't support Kurdish self-determination. I'd be the first to say absolutely. The thing is, how do you want that self-determination and how do you want to support it, right? Carving up the Syrian state in the middle of an actual imperialist war to change that government and to support Islamists, and at the same time to kind of pander to the Kurds in the north, who would get destroyed and crushed by the Islamists if it wasn't for US air cover that was supporting the jihadists to begin with. I'm telling you, it really opened my eyes to how the US operates, both in its hard power. We saw white phosphorus, war crimes. They literally destroyed Raqqa. It looked like Stalingrad. It was like no building was left untouched by US airstrikes and artillery. So you have the hard power, and then you have the soft power. The New York Times, The Atlantic, Vice, Vox, all the niceties that had their tentacles as well, right? Mm-hmm. That's ultimately what transformed me. I came back, I thought about it, I sat around, I said, I saw so much death, destruction, chaos. What did it all mean? What did it all mean? And it led back to, we thought we were fighting for something worthy. And it was worthy to fight against ISIS. I believe that. But it was all staged in a way to allow for much bigger plays to happen on top of that. A lot of people died not knowing that there were bigger machinery behind it, right? So ultimately my experience was, of course, tremendously positive isn't right the word, but it was definitely worthy to go and to fight against ISIS and to fight to defend people against an aggressor as horrible and as barbaric as the Islamic State was, as Daesh was. But behind that, I realized that a lot of the Syrian civil war was totally preventable, but it was escalated and the fuel was poured on the fire by outside actors, specifically United States, with Israel, Saudis, and the Emiratis from behind. So I'm telling you, the more you get intimate, the more you realize, holy shit.
All of that is so harrowing, man. And it's an honor to hear it from someone who was actually there. I mean, over here, I would hear things about Turkey sending rations and arms to ISIS using NGO trucks and stuff over the border. And like that reporter named Serena Shim, who magically blew up in a car.
Yep.
But I guess, one thing that I just wanted to point out for some of our younger listeners is when we're talking about Turkey is more important than other, surrounding ethnic or regional groups, we're looking at Istanbul. And when we're looking at Syria, we're looking at the Fertile Crescent. So in my mind, personally, unless there is something else notable that I'm not aware of, to me, this all comes down to economics and trade and the ability to control portions of the globe that are arguably the most important places to derive money.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. Hands down. If you think about it, a lot of people don't know behind the scenes, Turkey is in the midst of a lot of different oil deals and pipelines, right?
Yep.
Turkey is now going to be the main transit route of oil from where? From places like Azerbaijan, which just had the war with Armenia. So when you look at this, you end up realizing there are pipelines going through Turkey to Europe. And so Turkey has positioned itself as a key link connecting Europe with the Middle East and Asia, right? And if you think about Turkey's economic power, 80 million plus people, you think about Turkey's political and geostrategic power, and then you compare it with the surrounding areas, well, of course, screw the other areas. We have a strong Turkey. We can have a Turkey that houses US air bases, that houses tactical nuclear weapons on US aircraft in case we need them against the Russians, that can bring oil, natural gas, can pipeline everything that we need in that regards, and can also be a funnel of products and goods back and forth. And don't forget, they control a key area, the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. I mean, if you think about the Black Sea Axis, if you think about Sevastopol, this is the Russian naval base. It is the only warm water port of the Russian Federation, right?
I didn't know that.
So when you look at the geostrategic necessity of controlling the straits, of controlling the country that has access from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, then of course it becomes the key country. You have to have it. You have to, no choice.
I think Russia also had a port at Tartus in Syria, I believe.
They do. This was the warm water port is the historic, sort of Russian, but now they have Tartus. That's why Syria is so important to Russia. The Soviet Union had air bases and naval bases there, right? Which Russia inherited. And they're some of the only foreign soil bases of the Russian Federation. So of course, they're going to have them. They're going to keep them. So the US going in there, building their own bases was a huge escalation. Major escalation.
Well, I mean, that's incredibly interesting. I mean, it's super eye-opening just to hear all that, especially from somebody who's been on the ground and hear it from your perspective. I mean, a lot of these issues are so complicated that most Americans obviously don't even get past not even the surface level of it. I mean, most of the stuff will absolutely be news to any of our listeners. But just the intricacies of foreign affairs like that are so just lost on everyone in America that, like you said, they can just admit their complete hypocrisy on live TV right in front of everyone, and nothing will happen as a result because it's beyond their understanding. And then especially hearing like what you said about the anarchists aligning with the CIA, it's like, I mean, it's a meme at this point. Like, it's literally like most of what I deal with is in memes. And like, it is a common meme to say that anarchists are unknowingly regurgitating CIA propaganda, because the last thing the US intelligence agencies want people on the left here in America to do is support an existing socialist project in any country. So anything they can get you to believe that's bad about them, they will absolutely force that rhetoric in every way possible. And just like you said, the soft power, it's just, I don't know, it's really funny to me to hear it from your perspective as somebody who's experienced it firsthand. But I did want to get into some other things here. It's funny. I was worried I didn't have enough stuff written down to fill up like a couple hours, but seeing how much wealth of knowledge you have to give us, it's great just to see that that's not going to be a problem. I think that actually covered a lot of things that I had here, to be honest. Let me skip through some of this stuff. Did you have anything else you wanted to ask in the meantime, Jaron, while I'm looking through here?
Oh, no. I mean, I will say, if I wanted to give the anarchist take, the way that I perceive it is, in my mind, I'm not trying to make a state. I'm not trying to make an authoritative system. However, if you are going up to bat against the capitalist powerhouses of the world, yeah, you can't go about that without some system of organization. And to think that that is something that is feasible is a very, very serious mistake that is not going to work. I think that it's very prominent for me to say, insofar as anarchist philosophy, that you are going to end up simping for capitalism if you do not look at the larger picture. To me, anarchism is a philosophy whereby we are constantly looking at models and how to eliminate obtuse authority. So in a way, it's similar to, you guys are going to laugh, but Trotskyism, the permanent state of revolution, where we're looking at things and trying to get rid of the parts that don't
At least
work.
the permanent state of about to do a revolution.
Yeah, right. But I love hearing this perspective, because it's so eye-opening to look at it that way. Because you cannot go up into a fucking war zone filled with every kind of extremism you can possibly think of and aim to say, hey guys, my idea is nothing. That's just not going to work,
I had a friend tag me in a tweet the other day, and it said, and it was like with the clap back hand emoji, and it said, fascism can't be fought with authoritarianism. And I was like, hold up, then what the fuck are you gonna fight it with? Like, please, for the love of God, like,
did you miss World War II? Yeah, fuck me. Like,
I just picture one of the Jenner girls walking up with a fucking can of Pepsi. I'm like, what exactly is your fucking plan here? I'm like, oh my God, you don't have to be authoritarian leaning to understand that it's very hard to anything without authority.
Dude, just send QAnon some Pepsis. They'll come around. They won't be white supremacists anymore.
That's a whole nother can of worms.
Oh, Jesus, yeah. We want to do a whole episode on QAnon, and I feel like it's going to take us quite a while to even prepare for that. It's just ever expanding.
It has some deep links to the government if you look deep enough into it. If you look at some of the prominent people who are talking about it, your Steve Paciniks, the early Pizzagate stuff. Some of these people were former CIA and intelligence. So I think it's very interesting and plausible that it was an op altogether.
Interesting.
An
That's
experiment.
kind of been my suspicion all along. Yeah.
For sure. For sure.
I mean, we can talk about that if you want. I was going to try and get into your congressional run.
Sure, we can talk about that. The congressional run,
if you'd rather talk about QAnon, I don't know. I mean,
how does this circle into the congressional? How did you go from fighting ISIS to, you know what I really need to do? I need to go to Vermont and be a congressman.
Well, what I wanted to ask you,
put the AK down.
Before you get into that, I want to ask you, just a couple things about your run for Congress. Like, I know something that I encounter talking to other leftists, it seems like there's a lot of disdain for electoralism in general. Like the idea that we should be voting for change in a capitalist system is just not going to work. And so I did want to ask you if you actually believe in electoralism as a strategy for, getting any kind of leftist reform in any meaningful way, or if you did it just to get your message out there, to create awareness and give people, more of an idea that there is an alternative to just Republican or Democrat, that there is something outside of capitalism, just to expand people's vision, because I know it's so myopic here in America. But I also then wanted to ask you, during your congressional run, I noticed one of the things that you were really good at was reaching people who would be Trump supporters. People that people on the left consider to be too far gone, that we won't even bother talking to. And I've seen you say in other views that we can't, as leftists, write off people who have reactionary views, who are homophobic or even racist. We have to realize that they are working class people and they can be reached with a class message. And you can talk them out of these reactionary views if you are able to reach them. So I do want to ask you, what are some talking points that you could give people? What are some successes that you've had reaching people like that? But yeah, just in the overall question of electoralism, if you really think that that's a viable strategy, or if it was just a tool to create awareness, and how do you reach the people that we consider unreachable on the left?
I would start out with my favorite quote. You can vote out the Democrats and Republicans, but you can't vote out the CIA. So that pretty much sums up my electoralism.
That's good.
No, I have no faith in electoralism. You want to know what happens when you have faith in electoralism? You're riding down the street in Dallas and you get a bullet and your head explodes. That's what happens. When you believe that you can change things that are far more powerful than you can ever imagine. So no faith about electoralism. Only things will change with the massive social movement. Doesn't necessarily have to be violent. Doesn't have to be non-violent. It's going to happen however it happens. I don't fucking know. But I will say that the point for running was to raise awareness, was to give people not only an alternative, but to present information to people that mainstream media doesn't present them, a side of the arguments and a point of view that they normally wouldn't receive, and to demystify what it means to be a communist, right?
Yeah, which I think is very important.
Yeah, of course. A lot of working class and rural people who are reactionary think that the communists are, I don't know, drinking babies' blood and, sucking adrenochrome from young kids' heads and, big cabals and orgies and all that kind of stuff. I mean...
Wait, I thought that was us Jewish people.
it's Judeo-Bolshevism, Remember that one?
It's like cultural Marxism.
I'm so close to getting the Soros invite personally.
There you go. So I think one of the big things is basically to say, look, I'm a working class person. I have a farm here. I have a family. I participate in my community. And I believe that we should have a different system. We shouldn't have capitalism. We should have socialism. I believe that, we shouldn't be an empire anymore. I believe that, people deserve and have a right to healthcare and education and childcare, that the military is my least concern. The primary concern is the well-being of all the people. So when you talk to people like that, and when you present it that way, what are people going to say? Yeah, most of the people, yeah, of course. Or how are we going to pay for it? Well, cut the military, close the 1,000 foreign military bases we have, cut off all these, Wall Street deregulations and things like that. Regulate it. Not only regulate it, nationalize it. Why not? You're so patriotic. Red patriotism. Nationalize all major industries. Wouldn't that be great?
Yep.
Yeah, of course.
Absolutely.
Come on.
I think one important message to get out there to our average working class American is the simple fact that the Democrat and Republican Party are both against them. Like, neither party is the lesser evil. They're two heads of the same dragon hoarding masses of wealth and resources from the average American. And to me, this whole theory of only one of these two parties can win, so I need to choose the lesser evil is insane. It's like being told to choose one of these two people standing inches away. Which one would you prefer to beat the living shit out of you and your entire family? Oh, but there's also, here's a caveat, there's also a third person, but it's not practical because he's standing a little off in the distance and he's never gonna actually make it to you before these other two just beat your ass anyway. And just the idea that, okay, well, I guess I should be practical and choose one of these two insane options is, it's just crazy that the average American can't get their head around. I mean, I hate to tell people not to vote, like walk away, but that's actually better. That is actually better. I personally, this last election was the first time I voted presidentially third party, and I don't see me ever going back to a major party just because at this point, I see too much of it. And it's funny, I had a conversation with a liberal a while back, a very close friend of mine, and you tend to piss off liberals anytime you start bashing the Democrat Party. But
every day, baby.
Right. I asked him, I was like, what if for the last 170 years the Super Bowl was won by only one of two teams? Would you start questioning shit? And what if only two teams were given insane amounts of money, resource to recruit, train, you name it, every year? What if every single major sports network would only show games between these two teams every year? And what if the vast majority of your average fans only knew the name of these two teams? Would you eventually say, not only is this a fucked up game, but why would I even entertain it? Why would I even choose to be a fan of one of these two teams?
The problem there, Sterling, is that once you start talking about the possibility of a third position, they start thinking fascism, because they've already, not only in addition to that, duopoly that they've been given and only given those two options, they've also been steeped in fascist rhetoric, whether they realize it or not, because they've definitely been steeped in anti-communist rhetoric, in which they definitely know. So fascism just seems more likely to them to be a realistic third option because it brands itself in anti-capitalism. They will admit on a certain level that they hate capitalism because they know it's screwing them, but then they don't see communism as an option because, like Chris said, they think we're a bunch of blood drinking, orgy, whatever having. And so they just think that fascism must be the way to go, of course. And that puts us in the position that we're in.
Who doesn't want orgies?
Well, to go back to the second part of the question, really, how do you talk to people?
Yeah.
I think one of the major problems that I'm experiencing overall in the movement is a big divide between comrades who are students, academics, who do jobs that don't necessarily bring them in close proximity to working class people or even rural people on top of that. And then comrades who are real working class, who interact with the rural people, who live in rural areas, or who are farmers themselves, who look at the other comrades who end up castigating and saying, basically the same language of deplorables, this language that the white working class is somehow has a zero revolutionary potential or is outright reactionary. Basically, you have people who look down upon rural peoples and sort of farmers and, white proletariat, quote unquote, which in and of itself is a problem because the proletariat's unified. You can talk about it theoretically about the real material differences amongst racialized parts of the proletariat, but working class people, while they might have white privilege, are still oppressed altogether. So it's really not helpful when you have this kind of settler talk where somehow white people are irredeemable ontologically.
Yeah.
And this is coming from a person of color. I mean, I'm Iranian.
In addition, I did want to ask you at some point about farming and your experience as a farmer and how that, influences your politics and how that allows you to reach people who are real working class proletariats. But I think you were getting on a good point before we had some technical difficulties there. But you were saying in the vein of trying to reach people who the left typically writes off as reactionaries because they may hold some views that we find distasteful. I think you make a good point when you mention that a lot of people on the left have what you would call the language of the settlers book, or the deplorables thing. And you write these people off thinking that they're unreachable and writing them off as if they have white privilege. It really sets us back. I feel like we really do ourselves a disservice and do the whole movement a disservice because you can tell someone who's struggling and working a working class job that they have white privilege and they're not going to believe you. And that's only going to turn them away because they don't feel like they have that privilege. They may, but they don't feel it because you don't miss what you feel like you never had. Like they don't realize the times that they got pulled over and didn't get harassed by the police in a physically violent way. You know, they just don't realize it because it's not something that they experienced overtly. It's something that they did not experience. And to try and explain that to people who are working class, that they have a privilege that someone else at the same income level didn't have, it really sets you back if you come at them in a confrontational way like that. But you were going to go off on that. I would love to hear more of your input about it.
Sure. So my basic thing is, look, for example, I identify as queer. I don't announce it to everybody when I'm outside, right? I live in a very rural area, farming life, and very Republican area. Rebel flags, don't tread on me, Blue Lives Matter, all that kind of stuff. Even though it's Vermont, you think of Vermont, you think of progressive paradise.
Yeah.
In Burlington, in the cities, in rural areas, it's a different reality. It's a tale of two Vermonts. So one of the things to understand is if I'm out and a farmer says something homophobic or says something even Islamophobic or something like that, I'm not instantly going to say, you racist motherfucker, fuck you. No, I'm going to try to figure out in my mind, how best can I deconstruct this stuff? How best can I approach them? And there are a lot of very close comrades and friends I have up here and neighbors who can get sucked into the world of white supremacist ideologies, militia movement, the fascist organizing, 3%ers, all this kind of shit. They're up here. They're around.
Yeah.
The best way to approach that is to say, these motherfuckers don't care about you. First and foremost, speak their language. Speak the language of the working class. I don't come and throw them books, you know, boom, here, read this theory. No, I read the theory on my own as tools and instruments to sharpen my reasoning for how I can approach people. If somebody can raise 200 cattle, feed them, feed the family, take care of their hundreds of acres, I think they're smart enough to understand that they're getting fucked by the capitalist system, that they're getting screwed over, that the environment is changing and all this kind of stuff. Of course.
Yeah.
The question is, how do you bring them towards our position? And it takes time. A lot of our comrades don't put in the time and effort. They don't build long-lasting relationship with workers and farmers and people like the old timers did. Think about the generations before. Holy shit. You'd live in a rural area 10 years. Of course you'd build ties. Of course the people would come to understand your position. You can't just go there and pretend to organize for 2-3 months and think you're going to change people's mind. No, it takes investment. It takes time in people's. You have to build personal connections. For example, there have been people in my life who were homophobic, transphobic, Islamophobic, who after knowing me for a long time said, I don't feel that way anymore because I've learned from you, right? But if I just went there and said, fuck you, you homophobe, you bastard, you this, fascist, this and that, of course they're not going to learn. And they're going to get angry and they're going to go to the other side.
Right.
So my biggest plea to comrades out there is to take the time to understand that not everywhere is a safe space, that not everywhere you're going to be coddled and loved for who you are, that not everywhere you're going to flaunt your identities and be praised for it. You go to places and you say, I put myself last because that's what the revolution demands. I put myself at the bottom. Why? Because I'm here to serve a bigger cause. This is what religion got right, in a way. Religions all talk about put yourself at the bottom and focus on proselytizing and missions and this and that. Our movement once did that. We accomplished so much, hundreds of millions with red banners. Now we're flailing here. We're eating each other alive. So the biggest success that I have is just being a normal working class person without any of the frills. I help my neighbors. I help the community. Somebody needs help with the hay. I help. Somebody needs help with the animal. I help. Somebody calls in the middle of the night and the cow got loose. We go and help. Barn raising, all that stuff. And slowly people realize, wow, you're a communist? I didn't know. I never met a communist before. And slowly the mind changes. And you talk to some of the old timers in their 80s and you say, you remember Stalin was a hero. Him and FDR sitting together, right? Bring in some of that American patriotism and mix it with that World War II greatest generation shit. They eat it up. They eat it up. And then you ask them, why did they become the enemy? And they'll give some BS response. And you say, that's not true. Come on. You know better. You remember. And you slowly start working on them. And after months and months of talking, they're like, oh, yeah, you know, I had this one guy so happy, so proud in his 80s. I love Eisenhower. I love this country. Goddamn, I wore the uniform. After knowing him for a while, he said, I want to tell you something. This is the first time I'm voting for a communist.
Oh
I said,
my!
"That's awesome.
Oh my!
That's awesome."
Hell
Yeah.
yeah! Hell
Yeah.
yeah!
But it's because I put in the effort. I put in the time. I try to build these relationships. I try to show the community through praxis what it means to be a good communist, what it means to be a good family man, to take care of kids, to take care of a family here, to take care of, we're 4 generations living here. I'm on my partner's farm, right? And so we're expanding it. We're growing. Everybody's seeing how we're doing in the community. And also, I try not to be, I don't know. I used to be, when I was in the city, I used to have all the pins and badges and patches and all this stuff. And I was like really hardcore. Look at me, I'm nothing. Nothing.
Yeah.
It's not necessary. It's not necessary. People know what's in your heart, and eventually you talk about it. I love all that stuff. I mean, my whole house, hammer and sickles, the books, the flags, the posters. I love it. The main thing is, when you're approaching people, you have to realize that they have been under a massive psychological operation, Stockholm syndrome, all this kind of stuff for nearly a century of Red Scare. So in order to work that out, it takes time. It takes effort. It takes commitment. A lot of comrades don't have commitment. There are some amazing comrades doing union organizing, getting out there into the factories, getting out there on the restaurant lines, getting out there with the nurses, getting with the teachers. But there's a lot of comrades who are online in BS all day. What are you doing?
Yeah.
Get out there.
Yeah.
Get out there and organize. Talk to working class people. And this is the big thing. Theory informs practice. Practice informs theory. As you get out there and you talk to people, you begin to learn the tools to be able to convince people. You begin to change some of your theoretical presuppositions by engaging with working class people. And for me, nobody is ever too far gone.
Yeah.
When talking to people. I'm not talking about, armed SS guards here that I'm going to somehow convert them. No, then we pick up the rifle. Right? I'm talking about working class people in the community who might be more malleable to these kind of tendencies because they also seek community. They also seek to be in a group, and to kind of bring them over to our side, make them understand what we're doing. And that's why we use some of the language, quote unquote, red patriotism. Isn't it patriotic to give everybody healthcare? Isn't it patriotic for every person in the United States to have decent job, to have childcare? If you care about family values, don't you want families to not have to worry about how they're going to pay to take care of their kids, how they're going to pay for the schools?
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be patriotic? And people love that. They say, yeah, of course. I said, why aren't we doing it? Why you keep electing these rich bastards who keep screwing us all over? Their kids can go to school for free and they can go to the best schools. Their kids get out of military service. You know what? You want to have a war? Go take your kids front line. There you go. Number one, up the hill. Could you imagine Jared Kushner and Don Jr. going up the hill? I don't think so.
Well, it's so funny when you say stuff like that, because that's all common sense sounding stuff. Watching all your interviews when you were on the campaign trail, it sounds a lot like the same things that Bernie was saying when he was campaigning that seem very common sense. They almost seem, the left gets called childish a lot when we say things like this, because these are things that people inherently know, even from a young age, that things are not supposed to be this way, that they don't make any sense, that it should be different, that our country should take care of the people who can't take care of themselves, that it should actually work to help you rather than just keep you oppressed and keep you working your whole life to serve this machine that is holding you down. But over time, you just get indoctrinated, and then you start asking things like, well, how are you going to pay for it? And it's so frustrating. But yeah, I mean, like you said, it's very common sense stuff that should just be, it shouldn't be that hard to reach people with it. But what did you have, Sterling?
So 2 things. One, I want to echo something Chris was saying, and then I want to ask Chris a question deeper on the childcare thing. My first thing I want to echo is so many leftists, one of the constant questions they try to answer themselves is, what can they do? What type of praxis is best for them to help the cause, for them to help get more people involved and just help us get to a better future? And I think what Chris was just saying is incredibly powerful. And the most important thing we can do is just becoming one of our community. Like you're talking about keyboard warriors, you can sit there and emojis on Twitter all fucking day and make, fucking posts on Facebook all day. And we all do that. It's fun. Don't get me wrong. But going out and being part of your community and actively letting people know where you stand without shoving it in their face and letting them know this is what a communist looks like. This is what left ideology looks like. Out here, sweating and putting my blood into helping you. And I think, building like mutual aids in your community, like, public gardens and farms, like right there for your community. And, even like helping homeless people like have access to food that way. It's just incredibly powerful things we can do that are so much more valuable than any fucking tweet, no matter how many retweets you get. Go ahead, Mike.
Just to reiterate that real quick, while Chris was talking, it was making me think of, I don't think there's an episode of our podcast that goes by where I don't praise Rev Left Radio. But one of the things that he did say in an episode was that you are not going to get anywhere as a leftist convincing people or winning people over to our side if you are an asshole. If you're an asshole in your daily life, you are only going to piss people off and you're going to turn them away from this. And he says the best thing you can do is be nice to people, be selfless, sacrifice your own time and your own labor and your own effort and help people. And then once they get to know you and trust you and see that you are genuinely good-hearted and you have their best interest in mind and you're not totally selfish, then you tell them, oh, by the way, I'm a communist. Then they start to see that maybe it's not such an evil thing. And it's not some boogeyman that they should be scared of. And it's something that they will be more open and amenable to. But go ahead with the question that you had, Sterling.
Yeah, so I know that one of your big topics you were campaigning on, and watching a few interviews preparing for this episode, I know this was a hot topic, mainly because it's one of those topics I think that liberals can grasp a little easier than some of our leftist topics. But childcare is something that anyone can get their head around. That having access to childcare is very important, and so you were advocating for this. And I know when you said like, quote unquote, free childcare, you don't mean exactly what that is. You don't mean, and this is one thing liberals don't understand about socialism and communism is it's not free. When we say free, we just mean free at point of service. We already pay, tremendous amounts of money in taxes for services that benefit us in no way, that only harm other people. So we can easily allocate it to take care of it. And in fact, when you go further and you allow a private industry, say like the childcare industry, to exist within a private market alone, you allow it to set situational cost. This means that a private market can take advantage of those who are desperate, unfamiliar with the cost of services, or even familiar with the cost of services, which are already exaggerated. And even those who are actually well off can get taken advantage of, because we all know the big thing about sales is just trying to identify how much a person can afford to give you. And when you take the private nature of a business, even with something like childcare, that's so important to put the child first, that business still can't do that. They still have to put their finances first. Because if they don't, if they put service of their children before their financial exposure, their business would tank. They would lose. So even if in their heart they want to do what's best for these children and help out their community, they can only do so by partaking in capitalism and thinking of finances even before the child, because that's the only way their business can exist. And so I think that's something very important to explain to people when we talk about socialist components within a capitalist country and bringing in some of these components in industries that, let's be honest, why do you want capitalism in this industry?
Yeah, I think one of the big things that I emphasized was we're the richest country in history. We cannot heal our people. We can't house our people. We can't educate our people.
Yeah.
We can't provide a decent livelihood for our people. Our people are suffering, right?
Yeah.
And so childcare as one of the main things, if some of the poorest countries in history were able to provide childcare for their people, the fact that the richest country can't do it says a lot about our priorities, right?
Yeah.
So when I was speaking about childcare and when I was speaking about healthcare and these things, yeah, of course, should they be nationalized? Absolutely. Think about the jobs that would open up. If we took the money from the military and the money from these wars and the money from Wall Street and we invested it in our communities, how much stronger would our communities be? Think about it. If we think about how many diseases we could prevent, alcoholism, drug abuse, domestic violence, suicides, all of these diseases of despair, as you said, if we could have a society for the many, not the few, we could solve all of these issues on a large scale.
Yeah.
We could provide a high quality and standard of life for the people who make the society function, the people who take your trash, the people who deliver your mail, the people who send your packages, the people who farm your food. the people who pack your food, the people who shovel the shit. Think about these people and think about the fact that all of them are comrades. You just don't know it.
Completely agree. Completely agree. I say that all the time. Almost every working class American is a communist, and they just don't realize it.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Jerem.
I think one of the greatest myths of our society is measuring wealth in terms of money. I think that we have lost track of the idea that money is not something that is related to our meritocratic status. It's a tool. Money is a tool used to exchange goods and services that we need. And I think that a lot of times that's what we're losing in communication with a lot of Americans, because they have been subject to this propaganda for so long that we should worship the amount of money that someone has instead of measuring worth in some other tangible way, like what we're talking about right now. And, you know, you see it every fucking day. It doesn't matter where you go. It could be the grocery store. It could be on your smartphone. It could be literally anywhere. But we're always, constantly, 100% of our waking hours bombarded with the idea that the wealthy should be respected and should be admired based on the fact that they just happen to have more of this tool than the rest of us do. And that's all it is. It's just a tool. And that idolatry is what prevents the gears of economics functioning in a way that is beneficial to all of us. And that is something that is compounded on itself exponentially in the past 20 years. And it will only continue to do so unless we can recognize this empirical fact that we're talking about.
I think that's the battle of capitalism versus communism in a nutshell. It's just wealth versus community. What side do you really want to be on?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably the most single frustrating part of being anyone who's vaguely leftist, let alone a communist, is if you just try to explain to people that, you know, you just want to do what Chris is suggesting, that we have a society that is organized based around people's basic needs and is organized in order to help them rather than exploit them. And they think that you want to cause mass starvation and kill millions of people. You know, it's just, that's just what it comes down to. It's incredibly frustrating, but we just realized that we have an uphill battle ahead of us, and that's kind of the territory that we're playing on, because, you know, to be anywhere on the left in the West, you just have a great long struggle ahead of you.
Well, Mike, you know, Mao killed everybody.
Everyone in existence.
100%.
12 times over.
100 trillion, quadrillion.
Before we get off this, the child care thing, I would like to add one little thing on the back end, just because I think it does kind of help break down public versus private industry. You know, talking about healthcare industry, a conversation I have with, you know, liberals and Democrats all the time, because anything Obama did is like the fucking gospel. So it's like anytime I bring up the Affordable Health Care Act in a negative light, oh my God, what I am met with. But I think there are some very important issues with the Affordable Health Care Act. And we like to think of it as progressive, as a step in the right direction, and some people will call it a hybrid of public and private industry. But what I like to ask, and I'd love to give you a take on this, is, you know, whether or not a hybrid of public and private is actually better or worse than even just properly regulated private. Because with, for instance, with the Affordable Health Care Act, you know, insurance in a nutshell is taking a pool of people's financial risk and balancing their cost. For every person who doesn't have a house catch on fire that paid into this pool, they make it that much easier for those who do. So when the year is over and the money has been collected, you want the most financially beneficial in this pool of risk, as well as the most financially damaging. If either of those are removed, you basically change what insurance is intended to do. And the Affordable Health Care Act takes those with pre-existing conditions out of the private market and puts them directly on the taxpayers. So if you're only incurring the cost of those with pre-existing conditions, as we as the taxpayers are, you're not reaping the benefit of those paying into the pool to balance the cost. So while at this...
No, it's almost like it was doomed to fail. Like it was almost intended to fail,
exactly,
to turn people off of the idea of universal health care, which they seem to think that the ACA is, even though it's not. Like,
exactly.
The Republicans did draft it up in the 90s. So yeah, that's probably exactly what it was supposed to do.
And it was a corporate plan, so So yeah,
It was.
That was
And
it.
because while at the same time you have put the pre-existing condition burden directly on the taxpayers, you've removed that obligation from the private market, who still does not lower cost. The prices remain the same. In fact, they continue to go up because the health insurance industry, medical bills and everything keep going up because if you don't apply regulations to then correct and make these health insurance companies bring prices down, now that the most expensive patients are removed from the pool of risk, then now we're literally getting it from both ends. And that's what I try to explain to Democrats. You took them out of the private market. You made us pay for them in taxes, but you didn't remove the cost from the private market. You only removed the risk. The price stayed. And that's why I honestly think Obamacare, quote unquote, is literally worse than just what we had in the private market to begin with. We would have done so much better, in my opinion, with just a handful of fucking regulations.
I think one of the major problems is that Obama came in with the idea that we were going to go full public, that we were going to have a universal healthcare program.
Okay.
The problem is that instantly co-opted by corporations and sort of the corporate lackeys that he surrounded himself with. So of course it got watered down real quick, like you said, in the 90s Republican plan, Diet Romney care, so to speak, it was doomed to fail to begin with, as you said. Whether that was on purpose or not, I don't know, but it served its purpose. And I think that ultimately, and what Bernie was talking about and what others were saying, is that a public healthcare system, a single-payer healthcare system, would save a tremendous amount of money.
Mhm.
Not only that, think about, as a farmer, I'm going to connect it here. If you have healthcare for everyone, but you have shitty industrial food with subsidies to corn and to big agribusinesses that end up putting the shittiest, most polluted, chemically enhanced, high fructose corn syrup shit on your plate, obviously you're going to have a population of health problems.
Mhm.
Obviously. So for farmers like us who are organic, who are sustainable, who try to do carbon sequestration and land regenerative agriculture, we're screwed. We don't get any subsidies from the state. The big corporations that abuse the land, use pesticides, use horrible GMOs, pollute the land, horrible practices, they're the ones that get the subsidies.
Yeah.
We're not even taking care of the people who feed the people. Never mind giving them health care from all the shit that they eat and consume.
Yeah.
So, it's a whole holistic and systemic problem. And when you begin to talk to people about this, you realize the interconnection between healthcare, childcare, families, education, what we eat, how we live, how much can you sleep, all these kind of things. And you realize capitalism can't provide that. It can't.
No.
It's incapable of doing that on a fundamental level because it requires more. It requires more productivity, more growth, exponential growth, the conquering of all things, the commodifying of everything, living and non-living, the commodifying of past, present, and future commodities, water, air, everything's up for grabs, everything.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking when Sterling said that we'd be better off even with a private system, but with a handful of regulations. Like that was a major lib moment because all I can think of is like it's just a matter of time because you have to create more profits every year over year. Like you can't just stagnate and make the same amount of profits you made the year before. Yep. So even if you implemented those regulations and even if you got them pushed through, whatever levers of power are against it because they're being lobbied by the same health insurance industry that doesn't want them, it would still just be a matter of time before they'd have to go away in the name of making more profit. Eventually, it's just you're changing nothing about the underlying system.
Yeah, I was only saying in comparison to the Affordable Health Care Act, that would be that would be better. That is still
I get you.
I am not fighting for private market with regulation. I am fighting for public industry, just to be clear.
Would you have, Jaron?
Okay, so I will say in regards to farming, here's what capitalism can do. They can elect a billionaire that knows nothing about economics to bankrupt agriculture within his first year of his presidency due to poorly thought out tariffs. And then 3 years from then, capitalism will also supply you with a billionaire like Bill Gates to buy up the majority of that sloughed off agriculture, as he just did, and effectively monopolize it which is very ironic, especially if you're a free market stand, because guess what? The market is now homogenized.
Mhm.
So I don't know if we can insert the Larry David music here again, but that would be an ample opportunity to do so. That's something capitalism can do.
Yep.
Is fuck up a completely solvent industry and hand it to Bill fucking Gates.
Absolutely. Absolutely. When I saw that, I was shocked, but not surprised.
Yeah.
Oh my.
All right. Well, I think that's probably a good enough place to wrap it up. We've been going at it for about 2 hours now. I know we've taken up plenty of your time, and I can't thank you enough for doing this. I mean, seriously, Chris, this has been fantastic, and I would hope to be able to do it again sometime. But yeah, this is absolutely
Absolutely.
great.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, comrades. Really, I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Solidarity,
So if you could just plug your social media and your website, like tell our listeners where they can find you and find more about you.
Sure. So you can find me on Twitter at Chris Helali. That's Chris and then HELALI, www.christopherhelali.com. And I just started a podcast, Not One Step Back, that I'll be dropping. We have the trailer out, and there's a lot of great stuff coming down the pipeline, some big news items coming up because I do some investigative journalism on the side.
Very cool.
So look for that. And get ready for some really good interviews and things.
Very cool.
I'm really fascinated on a lot of topics that a lot of leftists don't like to touch, like JFK's assassination, 9/11, anthrax attacks. I'm deep in that world. So let's collaborate. Let's talk again.
Absolutely.
Comrades can always reach out to me. More than happy to answer questions, provide resources, and keep up the struggle. Stay healthy and safe. Solidarity to all the comrades. Let's fight for a better world.
Hell yeah.
Thanks so much, Chris. Thank you for your time. Thanks for doing this. Take care.
My pleasure. Take care, comrades.
All right. See you soon, Chris.
We'll see ya. Take care.